The Ford Carrier Strike Group had been keeping the North Atlantic open in August 2025 so that IKEA furniture could reach American living rooms, just like American sailors have been doing here for 40 years, before a circling aircraft noticed something that would set off the most aggressive submarine hunt since the Cold War. Everything was going well. The Russians had recently received orders from the Northern Fleet, which the Americans were unaware of. Get close to the Americans and gather all the information. However, Moscow was about to discover that confronting the U.S. Navy in the Atlantic is as foolish as telling your wife that you've put on 10 pounds. The tactical action officer inside the Ford S Battle Intelligence Center observed the submarine S vectors with the composure that comes from possessing 4 Arleigh destroyers. Capable of turning any submarine into a man-made reef, the Russians would reach torpedo range in precisely 47 minutes at their current speed. For the Russians, the math was easy. Once fired, their torpedoes would travel the remaining distance in less than 6 minutes. However, the Ford's escorts were equipped with anti-submarine rockets called Azroks, which could reach them in 90 seconds. The admiral wanted to know what the Russian warships' likely intentions were around 1503. The solution was clear. They would be within 40 minutes of information gathering if they continued on their current course. Going to general quarters was advised. However, the admiral responded with unadulterated American assurance. First, let's examine how much they want to make a fool of themselves. That is, supposing they were able to continue their strategy covertly. Link 16 automatically transmitted the submarine data to all NATO assets in the area within seconds. The subsequent events resembled witnessing a SWAT unit react to an attempted robbery. At a lemonade stand, 50 miles north, a British Type 23 frigate was performing maneuvers when it abruptly turned south at flank speed. From bases in Scotland, Norway, and Iceland, 8P8 Poseidon scrambled at a depth of 500 meters. Each of the $130 million submarine hunters could detect a shrimp sneeze. After following the Russians since they left port 3 days earlier, the Virginia-class submarine was finally given clearance to make her presence known. By 1515, the tactical picture had transformed from intriguing to hilarious. The Russians carried out what they believed to be a cunning trick, while the other submarines sank deep in an attempt to slip in undetected. One sub climbed to 200 meters while purposefully producing noise. Traditional 1943 Wolfpack tactics. However, in 2025, NATO's acoustic processors were able to distinguish between the silent submarines that sounded like a broken wheel in a shopping cart and a noisy decoy. The Russians weren't merely acting hostilely. In 1985, their synchronized intelligence operation would have been state-of-the-art. They sought to map the Ford's escort formations, record her acoustic signatures, and catalog radar emissions, all crucial information if you intend to engage the U.S. Navy in combat. The issue for the Russians was that, like a swarm of Karens attacking a restaurant manager, a large number of ships and aircraft gathered around their location, and they had no idea what was going to happen next. When the first PA Poseidon passed overhead at 200 hours, the 3 Russian submarines were about to discover what NATO meant by hammering. In order to become the most advanced submarine hunter in the world, the P-8, a Boeing 737, gave up transporting tourists to Florida. At a depth of 500 meters, it can hear a dolphin quarrel with its mate and costs $130 million. Additionally, NATO was discarding them as if they were becoming outdated. At 140 decibels, each buoy began pinging active sonar. That is louder than a gunshot, just so you know. Additionally, it takes place within a metal tube. Imagine being imprisoned inside a cargo container while someone plays drums outside indefinitely. The first thing inside the caisson sounded like the rock had just taken a swing, and someone had swapped out their submarine for a massive bell. The sonar operators most likely required neck surgery, since they tore off their headphones so quickly. The lovely reputation for silent service has vanished. They were now the ocean's loudest object. Every 30 seconds, like a Harley-Davidson in a meditation camp, ping. Just ping. No respite. No escape. The PA crews were having a great time as the Russians were running in circles. Every 4 hours, new crews arrive. Real food served without the need for a tube. Bathrooms that were separate from nuclear weapons. In essence, they were working from a flying workplace. The Russians, on the other hand, were confined to the underwater version of a middle seat on Spirit Airlines. However, the US Navy is still in its infancy. It's time for the Orleberg destroyers to start making money. They joined the acoustic onslaught by turning on their entire mounted sonar. A bow-mounted spherical array with hundreds of transducers that listens for echoes, bouncing off submarines. Like underwater radar, fierce people close to the ship are physically surprised by the amount of sound energy these devices can produce. The Russians were not only being pursued, they were witnessing the consequences of America's decision to exploit the ocean as a concept. The simulated attack runs followed. P-8 South would leap from a height of 25.0 feet while yelling toward the sea as if they were going to dump weapons. Due to their lack of sleep, the Russian submarine crews had to consider that every run might be genuine. Hard rudder, blow ballast, and emergency dive. It's similar to someone attempting to trick you 50 times in the hand slap game. Even when you are aware that they are merely teasing you, you nevertheless flinch every time. The Cassin attempted a 30-knot run to break contact, which is the underwater equivalent of flooring it in a police pursuit. 43,000 horsepower was forced through the water by the OK 650-volt reactor, which sounds amazing until you consider that it sounded like someone tossed a washing machine full of hammers down an elevator shaft. However, why would the Russians tolerate all of this nonsense? Take a look at the radars on the Ford's mast. Each radar has unique frequencies, pulse patterns, power levels, and fingerprints. You can create jammers to bind it if you get those. They were categorizing every emission and recording the whole electromagnetic spectrum. During flight operations, the carrier launches aircraft every 90 seconds. Cruise ship schedules, maintenance windows, and vulnerability times are all shown by that pattern. They were creating a digital model of American carrier operations by tracking which escorts utilized, which data link channels, and how the formation communicated. They may create specialized weapons and strategies to target carrier groups, thanks to this intelligence. However, NATO refused to allow them to do their task. In order to confuse their pursuers, all 3 submarines deployed acoustic decoys, which are devices made to simulate submarine sounds. The response from NATO was excellent. Each decoy was categorized by its computer in roughly 1/3 of a second, essentially said, "Huh, that's cute," and continued to monitor all 3 of the actual submarines flawlessly. It was similar to witnessing someone attempt to get away from the police by hurling a mannequin out of their vehicle while the police had satellites, helicopters, and your license plate number. And things would only get worse from this point on. NATO had transformed submarine hunting into a type of performance art by R-24. A British ship carrying 2 kilometers of hydrophones arrived with her Type 2087 towed array sonar. Essentially, listening devices are submerged behind her. MH-60 Romeo helicopters begin operating in shifts, searching for the subs by lowering their dipping sonar while hovering 50 feet above the ocean. Thermal climb layers, which are essentially underwater temperature barriers that can deflect sonar, were used by the Russians in an attempt to hide. Unfortunately, dipping sonar passes right through them as if they didn't exist. It's similar to attempting to hide behind a glass door from your wife. However, the coordination required for all of this was ridiculous, despite how simple these aircraft made it appear. Additionally, a single mistake could result in someone bonking another person. In order to do this, NATO separated the airspace into blocks, with P-8S operating between 20,000 and 25,000 feet, helicopters operating below 500 feet, and aircraft spaced 5,000 feet apart horizontally. Particular radio frequencies were allotted to each country. Due to the need for translation, Americans were on UHF, the British were on VHF, and Norwegians were on both. Similar to air parking spaces, each aircraft had a designated patrol box, and leaving your box required authorization from the airborne controller. The controller was managing airplanes from 3 distinct countries, each with unique capabilities and constraints. In real time, the Data Fusion Center at Northwood combined sensor feeds from every platform to create a 3D image of the battle area that resembled the most expensive video game ever made. However, these sailors were having a great time with the Russians in real life. The helicopters would lower their sonar, begin pinging, and hover just over the submarines. The Russian crews could likely feel it in their teeth. The Arleigh Burke destroyers, meanwhile, weren't using all of their sonar. In order to record whatever sound the Russians made, they set up their ANSQR-19 towed arrays, essentially dragging their own underwater microphones. One Russian submariner reportedly asked his captain if they could simply come to the surface and apologize because the pings were upsetting his stomach. Not only were the Russians being pursued, they were witnessing the consequences of America's decision to exploit the ocean as a speaker system. Soon, the submarine screen showed more sonar interactions between P-8S over medium-depth helicopters and surrounding surface ships than Akata Shane's Instagram notifications. This was no longer hunting. It was a smackdown. Russia was unable to find a way out of the 48-hour EDM festival that NATO had transformed the Norwegian Sea into, and the base never stopped. Here's the lovely bit, though. Do you recall the Virginia-class submarine we discussed? This American submarine used a TB-30 for towed array sonar, which ran so silently on electric motors that it was essentially a ghost with torpedoes. To maintain perfect track position for 48 hours. The crew was observing this as if it were a Netflix documentary titled Making This Submariner. Why Russia can't? Every sound, every evasive move, and every last-ditch effort to break contact were all being recorded. The Russians made every effort. Take cover in underwater canyons. Like fishing in a barrel, NATO placed helicopters immediately overhead and used dipping sonar. Radically altered the depth that could be followed from the surface to the ocean floor by the destroyer's sonar. Run and drift, like a dancing partner who was more familiar with the routine than they were. The American substitute matched every move. The skipper decided to send a message at one point. Their BQQ-10 Bow-Ray produced a single, brief burst of active sonar. Not enough to reveal their precise location, but enough to inform the Russians that they have been tracked all along. Imagine spending 2 days being pursued by John Cena. Even though you can't see him, he is undoubtedly present. Now and then, he murmurs, "You can't see me." It's just a mental mess. P-8 personnel had created a system by day 2 in order to avoid the Russian personnel falling asleep during REM sleep cycles. They timed their sonar pings. Ping. It's similar to having a roommate who never wakes up despite setting their alarm every 5 minutes. After 48 hours, the Russian sailors were likely conversing with people who weren't there and seeing colors that don't exist. And it wasn't finished yet. The Russians were on the verge of becoming frantic to cut off communication. The 3 Russian submarines made a valiant attempt to flee after 48 hours. They employed every tactic in the Soviet manual, which would have been fantastic if NATO hadn't published the guidebook in 1982. The P-8 switched to magnetic anomaly detection and bottom train. Destroyers had them covered from the surface to the seafloor with radical depth charges. Fire all of the remaining decoys. They were cataloged like Pokémon cards by NATO systems. They're all worthless, but you have to catch them all, at least most of the time. The Russians quickly discovered after a few hours of this that attempting to cut off communication with NATO in the Norwegian Sea is akin to attempting to lose the IRS during tax season. They are aware of your current location, your plans, and the amount you owe them. At last, the Russians were forced to abandon their intelligence operation, which is military jargon for fleeing while seeming as though it had been planned all along. Still submerged, They withdrew north while likely writing reports about the successful reconnaissance operation, which most definitely did not entail 48 hours of acoustic blasting. Like bouncers walking someone out of a club, NATO kept in touch as they retreated. To make sure they truly went, and to add insult to injury, the P-8 followed them halfway. We're maintaining appearances even though everyone is aware of what transpired. NATO gathered sufficient acoustic intelligence over those 48 hours to identify these submarines from space. NATO's database now includes every pump, valve, and even the way their toilets flush. This was portrayed by Russian official media as a successful intelligence collection operation. Yes. Additionally, the Titanic's ability to detect ice was successfully tested. They discovered that the Norwegian Sea is a NATO swimming pool with less disputed waters. Overall, the lesson was straightforward but powerful. You can construct as many sophisticated submarines as you like, but perhaps you shouldn't venture into the deep end the next time if you can't withstand today's of democracy's best songs being played over active sonar. If you enjoyed this video, then subscribe to my channel, WW to Revealed, for more incredible stories and obscure historical events.